She was the most beautiful woman in the world. He was the most troubled young man in Hollywood. And from the moment they met on the set of Giant in the summer of 1955, Elizabeth Taylor could not stand James Dean. She thought he was unprofessional. She thought he was reckless. She thought he was a child playing at being an actor, while the rest of them were doing real work. She was wrong. And the night she figured that out changed her forever. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins in a small town in Indiana, in a house that smelled like cedar wood and silence, where a 9-year-old boy stood in a hallway holding a suitcase he did not understand, waiting for a father who had already decided that grief was too heavy a thing to carry alone. James Byron Dean was born on February 8, 1931, in Marion, Indiana. His mother, Mildred Wilson Dean, was a gentle woman who loved poetry, music, and the quiet beauty of ordinary things. She saw something in her son from the beginning, a sensitivity, an intensity, a way of looking at the world that seemed older than his years. She called him her little dreamer. She read to him at night. She took him to see his first play when he was 4 years old. And when the curtain came down, young Jimmy turned to her with wide eyes and whispered, "They made me feel it. Mama." How did they do that? Mildred laughed softly and told him that was the magic of storytelling. That some people had a gift for making others feel things they had buried deep inside themselves. She could not have known that she was describing her own son. She could not have known much of anything about what was coming, because on July 14, 1940, when James Dean was 9 years old, Mildred Wilson Dean died of uterine cancer. She was 29 years old. She had barely lived at all. The days after her death existed for young Jimmy in a kind of gray fog. He remembered the smell of flowers at the funeral home. He remembered the sound of crying adults whose grief seemed to fill every room. He remembered standing at the graveside and not understanding why the sky was so blue on such a terrible day. And then he remembered the suitcase. His father, Winton Dean, was a dental technician who had moved the family from Indiana to Santa Monica, California, where Mildred had hoped the warmer climate might help her failing health. After her death, Winton made a decision that would echo through his son's entire life. He could not raise the boy alone. He did not know how. The grief was too big, the responsibility too enormous, and so he packed Jimmy's things into a small brown suitcase, drove him to the train station, and sent him back to Indiana to live with Winton's sister, Hortense, and her husband, Marcus Winslow, on their farm in Fairmount. Jimmy was 9 years old. He stood on a train platform holding that suitcase, watching his father's car disappear into traffic. And he understood something in that moment that no child should ever have to understand. He understood that the people you love most could simply leave. That no matter how much you needed someone, the world did not guarantee that they would stay. He never fully recovered from that understanding. The Winslows were good people, kind, patient, hard-working Indiana farm folk who gave Jimmy a stable home, a warm bed, and all the love they had to give. But they could not fill the particular shape of the hole that had been left inside him. Nobody could. Jimmy threw himself into everything with a kind of desperate energy that the adults around him found both impressive and unnerving. He played basketball. He performed in school plays. He read voraciously. He rode motorcycles with a fearlessness that made his aunt grip the kitchen counter whenever she heard the engine start up outside. He was searching for something, some way to feel alive, some way to prove that he existed, some way to fill the silence that his mother had left behind. He found it, temporarily, in acting. His high school drama teacher, Adeline Knoll, saw his potential immediately. She pushed him, challenged him, entered him in competitions. Jimmy won. He won everything. He performed with an emotional rawness that left audiences uncomfortable and exhilarated in equal measure. There was something happening when James Dean stood on a stage that was different from what happened when anyone else stood there. He was not performing emotions. He was excavating them. He was reaching down into himself and pulling up things that most people kept carefully buried. After high school, Jimmy moved to California to study acting. He found his way to the Actors Studio in New York, where he immersed himself in method acting, the technique pioneered by Lee Strasberg that demanded actors draw on their real emotional memories to fuel their performances. For most students, this was an intellectual exercise. For Jimmy, it was something else entirely. He had more than enough raw material. He had the platform in Indiana. He had the brown suitcase. He had 9 years old and no mother and a father who drove away. By the early 1950s, James Dean was working in New York, doing small television roles and theater work, building a reputation among those who knew as someone extraordinary. He was difficult sometimes, moody, withdrawn, prone to long silences, and sudden emotional outbursts. Directors found him frustrating. Casting agents found him peculiar. Fellow actors found him mesmerizing. Word got to Hollywood. It always did. In 1954, director Elia Kazan cast James Dean as Cal Trask in the film adaptation of John Steinbeck's East of Eden. It was Dean's first major film role, and what he delivered was not a performance in any conventional sense of the word. It was a confession. Cal Trask was a young man desperate for his father's love, haunted by abandonment, burning with a need to be seen and understood that he could not articulate and could not suppress. James Dean did not have to act any of that. He simply had to remember. The film was released in March of 1955. The reaction was unlike anything Hollywood had seen in years. Critics used words like devastating and astonishing. Audiences left theaters in silence. Something cracked open inside them. James Dean was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was 23 years old. He had been in Hollywood for barely 2 years. And now, in the summer of 1955, he was arriving on the set of Giant. But that is not where this story changes. This is where Elizabeth Taylor enters. Elizabeth Taylor in 1955 was 23 years old and already one of the most famous women on earth. She had been a movie star since childhood. Discovered at age 9 by a Universal Pictures talent scout who saw something in her violet eyes that the camera could not look away from. She had grown up inside the Hollywood machine, had learned its rhythms and its rules, had survived its pressures and its cruelties with a combination of genuine toughness and extraordinary grace. She was also, by 1955, deeply unhappy in ways that the public could not see beneath the glamour and the magazine covers. Her first marriage, to hotel heir Conrad Hilton Jr., had lasted barely a year and had been marked by cruelty that Taylor never fully spoke about publicly. Her second marriage, to British actor Michael Wilding, was a quieter, gentler affair. But there were tensions beneath the surface that would eventually pull it apart. Taylor was someone who loved fiercely and completely. Someone who needed connection the way other people needed air, and she had not yet found what she was looking for. She arrived on the set of Giant in the summer of 1955, ready to work. Giant was an ambitious production, a sweeping epic about Texas oil and power and the passage of time, based on Edna Ferber's novel. Taylor was playing Leslie Benedict, a strong-willed Maryland woman who marries into Texas ranching royalty. Rock Hudson was her co-star. George Stevens was directing with the meticulous, demanding precision that had made him one of Hollywood's most respected filmmakers. And James Dean was there, playing Jet Rink, a surly, resentful ranch hand who discovers oil on his small piece of land and transforms himself into a tycoon, carrying his bitterness and his loneliness with him all the way to the top. The role suited him in ways that nobody on set fully understood yet. From the first day, Elizabeth Taylor found James Dean difficult. He was late to call times. He mumbled his lines in rehearsals in ways that made it impossible to play against him. He disappeared between takes, wandering off to sit alone somewhere on the vast Texas location, staring at nothing for long stretches of time. He ignored basic courtesies. He seemed to exist in a private universe that intersected only occasionally with the one everyone else was occupying. Taylor was a professional. She had been working on film sets since she was a child. She knew what professionalism looked like, and this, she was certain, was not it. That boy does not know how to be part of a company, she told a friend during the early weeks of filming. He acts like the rest of us are inconveniences, like we exist to serve whatever mood he happens to be in that day. She was not entirely wrong. Dean could be genuinely inconsiderate, genuinely difficult, genuinely exhausting. The dark side of his method was that he sometimes confused his own emotional process with the entire world's responsibility. But she was also missing something, and then came the night that changed everything. It was mid-August, deep in the Texas summer, on a location outside Marfa that seemed to exist at the edge of the known world. The day's filming had run long. Stevens had pushed the company through the heat, chasing a particular quality of late afternoon light that kept shifting just out of reach. By the time the director finally called the last cut, most of the cast and crew were exhausted, sunburned, and eager to reach the relative comfort of their accommodations. Taylor was walking to her car when she noticed something through a gap in the equipment trucks. James Dean, sitting alone on an overturned equipment case at the far edge of the set, still in his jet rink costume, looking up at the Texas sky. He was not reading. He was not talking to anyone. He was not doing anything that she could identify. He was simply sitting there, very still, in the enormous silence of the Texas night, looking up at the stars with an expression on his face that she could not immediately name. She almost kept walking. She had her car waiting, had a telephone call to make to her children back in California, had every reason to continue past the gap in the trucks and leave James Dean to whatever private ritual this was. Instead, she stopped, and then, because Elizabeth Taylor was fundamentally someone who moved toward things rather than away from them, she walked through the gap. "You are going to miss the bus to the hotel," she said, for lack of anything better. Dean did not startle. He seemed to have heard her coming. He glanced at her briefly, and then looked back up at the sky. "I know," he said. "I have a motorcycle." She stood there for a moment, feeling slightly foolish, and then, because sitting down was easier than explaining why she was still standing there. She sat on the equipment case beside him. The Texas sky above them was extraordinary. The kind of sky that only exists in very flat, very dark places far from city lights, dense with stars in a way that feels almost implausible, like a painting someone made too beautiful to be believed. They sat in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had a quality that Taylor would later find difficult to describe. A sense of two people simply existing in the same space, without the performance that usually accompanied existing in the same space with another person in Hollywood. It was Dean who spoke first. "My mother used to take me outside at night," he said, not looking at her. "When I was little, before she died, she would point at the stars and name them. She knew all of them. Or at least she told me she did. I do not know if she actually did. I was 5 years old. I believed everything she said." Taylor looked at him. The Texas stars were reflected in his eyes, those strange, intense eyes that the camera was already in love with. "How old were you?" she asked. "When she died." "9, he said. Just that. One word, 9. Taylor said nothing for a moment. She was calculating something some interior arithmetic. "I nearly died when I was 9, she said finally. "Double pneumonia. I was sick for months. My mother stayed by my bed every night." She paused. "I never thought about what it would have been like if she had not been there when I woke up." Dean turned and looked at her then. Really looked at her, in that unnerving way he had of looking at people, like he was reading something written on the inside of your face. "You know what the strange part is," he said. "I cannot remember her voice anymore. I can remember her hands. I can remember the smell of her. I can remember she had a laugh that sounded like it surprised her every time. But I cannot remember her voice. And I keep thinking that someday I will forget the hands too. And then the smell. And then the laugh. And then there will not be anything left." Elizabeth Taylor, who had been raised to be composed in public, who had learned before she was 10 years old how to present a polished surface to the world regardless of what was happening underneath, felt something give way inside her chest, because she recognized what he was describing. Not the specific content of it. She had not lost a parent at 9, had not been handed a suitcase and put on a train, but the fear underneath it. Ian, the fear that the people you loved most could become unreachable, could recede into silence and forgetting, could simply not be there one morning when you needed them. She had been carrying that fear quietly for years. She had never heard anyone say it out loud before. "I think that is why you act the way you do," she said without entirely meaning to. Dean raised an eyebrow. "What way is that?" She considered how to say it honestly without being unkind, and decided that honesty without kindness was not honesty at all. It was just cruelty with better posture. "Like you need everyone in the room to feel something real," she said. "Like pretending is not enough. Like if you are not actually feeling it, genuinely feeling it, then it does not count." He was quiet for a long moment. "I have been told that is a problem," he said. "I have been told it is unprofessional," she said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "By you, specifically," he said. "By me, specifically," she agreed. Another silence, but different now. Warmer. Something had been acknowledged that changed the air between them. "It is not a problem," Taylor said finally. "It is just that the rest of us do not always know how to hold that much real feeling. It is uncomfortable. We are used to the performance. When someone comes in doing something else, it feels like they are doing it wrong. But they are not doing it wrong. They are just doing something harder." Dean looked at her for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "A movie star," he said. "I expected a movie star." She laughed. The first time she had genuinely laughed around him. The first time the wall had come down enough to allow it. And the sound of it seemed to surprise her. Or, just as he had described his mother's laugh surprising her, and for a fraction of a second they were both aware of the strange echo of that. "What are you then?" he asked. "I'm not a movie star." She thought about the question with more seriousness than it perhaps deserved, or perhaps exactly the seriousness it deserved. "I am someone who is very afraid of losing people," she said. "And who is very bad at showing it. And who overcompensates by being very good at showing up on time." He laughed then. A real laugh. Not the polite social version, but the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, the kind that sounds surprised. And Elizabeth Taylor heard it. And something in her relaxed, that had been braced for a long time. They sat there under the Texas stars for another 2 hours. They talked about his mother. They talked about her childhood on film sets. The strange fishbowl existence of being looked at by the world, before you understood what being looked at meant. They talked about loneliness, not as an abstraction, but as a specific, textured reality that both of them knew the exact dimensions of. They talked about acting, about what it was for, about whether there was a difference between performing a feeling and actually having it, and whether that difference mattered, and whether the answer changed depending on who was watching. They did not talk about the things that were wrong with their lives. His recklessness, her unhappy marriage, the darkness that surrounded both of them in different forms. They did not need to. Those things existed in the space around the conversation without needing to be named. What happened in those 2 hours on that equipment case in Texas was something that Elizabeth Taylor had almost no experience of, despite being one of the most famous and sought after people in the world. Someone sat next to her without wanting anything from her. Someone spoke to her without performing. Someone was simply present with her, honestly present, without agenda or calculation, or the 1,000 invisible negotiations that usually accompanied human contact at the level of fame they both inhabited. It was, she would say much later, one of the most intimate conversations of her life. And here is where everything begins to shift. The next day on set, Elizabeth Taylor played a scene with James Dean that had been giving the production trouble for days. A confrontation scene, Jet Rink and Leslie Benedict circling each other with old grievances and unspoken feelings, two people who understood each other in ways they would never admit. It had been shot twice already and had not worked. The chemistry was wrong. The distance was wrong. Stevens set up the shot for a third attempt. Taylor and Dean took their marks. And then something happened that people who were on that set would talk about for the rest of their careers. They looked at each other. Just that, before the cameras rolled, before any dialogue. They looked at each other with the ease and the weight of two people who had sat together the night before under the stars and said things they had not said to anyone else. All of that was in the look. All of the real thing underneath the scene, underneath the characters, underneath all of it. Stevens called action. The scene worked. It worked completely. It worked in the way that the best film moments work, where you are not watching two actors. You are watching something true. When it was over, the set was quiet for a moment before anyone said anything. Stevens said, very quietly, "That is it. Print." And Elizabeth Taylor looked at James Dean across the scene, and James Dean looked back at her. And they both knew something had changed that morning that was going to be permanent. They became, from that point forward, something rare in Hollywood, genuine friends. Not the transactional kind of friendship that the industry manufactured between co-stars. Not the performance of closeness for publicity purposes, but the real thing. The kind built on a night in Texas and a conversation about a mother's voice that was slowly being forgotten. Taylor looked out for him in ways she had not looked out for anyone before. She defended him to Stevens when the director's patience ran thin. She sat with him between takes in the particular comfortable silence that had characterized that first night. She learned to read his moods, to understand which silences were the dangerous ones, and which were simply the ordinary weather of a person who lived mostly inside their own head. Dean, for his part, opened to her in ways he rarely opened to anyone. He showed her his journal, pages of handwritten poetry and observations and fragments that she described years later as unlike anything she had ever read, raw and precise and burning with intelligence. He talked to her about his ambitions beyond acting, about wanting to direct someday, about ideas for stories he wanted to tell. He was, she discovered, not a troubled young man playing at being an actor. He was an extraordinarily gifted, deeply wounded human being who had found in acting the only language sufficient to the things he needed to say. The difficulty, the moodiness, the apparent inconsiderateness. All of it made sense once you understood what was underneath it. He was not trying to be difficult. He was trying to survive the weight of himself. That understanding, once she had it, never left her. Filming on Giant wrapped in September of 1955. The cast and crew scattered back to their various lives. James Dean went back to Los Angeles, back to the racing circuits and the motorcycles and the relentless acceleration that seemed to be his primary response to the fact of his own existence. Elizabeth Taylor went back to her marriage, her children, the ongoing negotiations of her personal life. They wrote to each other. They telephoned. Taylor tried, in the oblique way that people try when they sense danger without being able to name it, to tell him to slow down. To be careful. To remember that the people who needed him around preferred him breathing. He laughed when she said things like that. Not dismissively, warmly, but with a quality that she would recognize later, much later, as the laughter of someone who has never entirely believed their continued existence is something to be protected. On September 30, 1955, James Dean was driving his Porsche 550 Spyder on California Route 466 near Cholime, California. He was 24 years old. He was on his way to a racing competition in Salinas. The late afternoon sun was sitting low in the sky at the angle that makes other drivers nearly impossible to see. A Ford Tudor sedan turned across his path. There was no time. There was not even a fragment of a moment. James Dean died that afternoon on a California road, 2 weeks before East of Eden was nominated for 3 Academy Awards, 6 weeks before Rebel Without a Cause would open in theaters and change American cinema forever, and months before Giant would be released to the kind of reception that confirmed what Elizabeth Taylor had recognized on that Texas equipment case. That James Dean was not simply a talented young actor. He was something rarer and more fragile and more necessary than that. He was someone who had found a way to put the truth of human loneliness into a form that other people could see and recognize and feel less alone. Because of. Elizabeth Taylor was in New York when she heard the news. She did not speak about it publicly for a long time. When she did speak about it, she chose her words with unusual care, as if every sentence had been handled and turned over many times before being spoken aloud. She said he was the most naturally gifted actor she had ever worked with. She said he made everyone around him better by refusing to pretend. She said that working with him had changed something in her own approach to performance, had taught her that the distance between the real thing and the representation of the real thing was a distance worth closing. And she said, in a 1956 interview that became one of the most quoted things she ever said about him, something that has stayed in the record because it is so plainly true. I met a boy on a set in Texas who I thought was inconsiderate and difficult and not quite worth my patience. Then I sat next to him under a sky full of stars, and he told me about his mother, and I realized I had been looking at the outside of him and missing everything that mattered. He taught me something I had not known I needed to learn. He taught me that the most important thing about a person is not what they show you first. Decades passed. Elizabeth Taylor went on to live one of the most dramatic and scrutinized lives in 20th century history. 8 marriages, extraordinary films, personal tragedies and reinventions, and the particular endurance of a woman who had been a public figure since childhood and had learned to carry that weight and still show up. She became a global advocate for acquired immune deficiency syndrome research during the crisis of the 1980s, channeling the same fierce loyalty that had characterized her friendships into a cause that the rest of Hollywood was afraid to touch. She never stopped talking about James Dean when people asked. She never let him become abstract, never let him become only the symbol he had turned into. The rebel, the icon, the immortal young man frozen at 20, 4 in black and white photographs and poster images, and the cultural shorthand for everything brief and beautiful and wasted. She remembered the specific person. The one who sat on an equipment case in Texas at the edge of the world and could not remember his mother's voice and was afraid of the day when he would forget everything. The one who laughed like he was surprised by it. He did not die young. Taylor said once, in her later years, when someone suggested that his early death was primarily a tragedy of lost potential. He died having said everything he needed to say. East of Eden alone would be enough. Rebel Without a Cause alone would be enough. Those films are not the fragments of an unfinished life. They are a complete statement. He got his message through. Not everyone does. She paused. I just wish I had more time to sit next to him, she said. James Dean left behind 3 completed film performances. 3. Most working actors will spend decades in the industry without producing a single moment of the caliber that Dean delivered routinely in those 3 films. What he achieved in the 24 years he was alive, most of those years spent in grief and searching, only the last 2 or 3 in any proximity to the work he was capable of, suggests something almost unfair about the distribution of talent. Like the universe had miscalculated. Like it had given one person more of something than any single lifetime could use. But here is what the story of Elizabeth Taylor and James Dean is finally about. It is not about talent. It is not about tragedy. It is not about the particular cruelty of a short life. It is about what happens when you sit down next to someone you have already decided you understand, and they say something that makes you realize you have been looking at the outside and missing everything that matters. It is about the fact that the most difficult people in your life are sometimes the ones carrying the heaviest things. It is about a 9-year-old boy on a train platform holding a suitcase, and the particular shape of the wound that moment made, and the extraordinary, heartbreaking, luminous thing that wound eventually became in the hands of someone who had the courage to keep reaching into it. Elizabeth Taylor sat down on an equipment case in Texas in August of 1955 because she almost kept walking and then did not. She made a decision in a fraction of a second that changed the way she understood human beings for the rest of her life. That fraction of a second cost her nothing. It gave her everything. The stars over Marfa, Texas, are still there. They were there before any of this happened, and they will be there after all of it is forgotten. But on one particular night in 1955, 2 people sat beneath them and told each other the truth, and that truth traveled forward through time in the shape of a friendship. A performance, a quoted sentence, a memory that refused to become abstract. Some lights are too important to keep hidden in the shadows. If this story moved you, if you have ever sat next to someone and seen them clearly for the first time, subscribe and hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important thing about a person is not what they show you first. And ring that notification bell for more stories about the legends who changed everything, not just by what they achieved, but by who they were when nobody was watching.